So as the title says, we are talking today about living well with bipolar disorder. My name is Stephen Finley, and I'm the manager of the Mood Disorders Association of British Columbia. And I'd like to welcome my former boss and old friend, James Levy. Welcome, James.
Hey, thanks, and good to see you again, Steve.
Thank you for coming. So James, can you please tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your job, your family, your interests, and what's important to you?
Sure. Well, why don't I start with family, because that's what's important to me. So I have 4 kids. My oldest is my stepson from my wife's first marriage, and he is 25 and an engineer. My middle daughter, Taylor, is 18 and just started University of Calgary studying biology. And then I've got twins that are 15 and in grade 10 and studying languages. And then finally we just got a puppy. So that's what's important to me. My wife is a musician, and so it's great to hear her, live that passion as well. For me, I work at TELUS, and I have a pretty exciting role at TELUS. I'm responsible for our 5G program office. So that's what are we going to do with 5G? Who's going to buy it? How are we going to make money on it? And so I lead a team that's responsible for answering those questions and rolling out those services to our customers across the country.
Thank you. I'm glad you have a puppy in your family because they're important.
Oh, very cute. What kind of dog is that, Steve?
She's a rescue. We just got her 3 weeks ago because my wife's dog, who she'd had for 13 years, we had to put her down in April. And that was very hard on my wife, who was already dealing with depression. So she survived for a while, but finally decided she had to get another dog and applied to a number of rescues. So the rescue says that she's a Chihuahua cross. We think she's a cross of Chihuahua and Italian Greyhound.
Cool. She's a very cute dog.
She's a very good dog.
Yeah, and like we have a number of mental health issues in our home as well, and I find a dog is a very good support partner in kind of helping people cope with their illness.
They're wonderful. And as you know, I asked you to do this video with me because you enjoy a successful and meaning and rewarding life, but at the same time, you live with bipolar disorder. And to start with, when did you first find out about having bipolar disorder, and how did that happen?
Well, I should start by saying my mom has it, and so she was diagnosed in her 20s. I wasn't diagnosed until I turned 40, but if I look back, I probably had my first episode when I was about 20. When I was diagnosed with bipolar 1. And my very first episode in my 20s started as a manic episode, and then it degraded into a mixed episode. That lasted for a number of months. And then I was depressed for about a year after that. And then I've kind of had episodes periodically since then.
So thinking about the episode in your 20s, and you weren't diagnosed, what did you feel? Did you suspect anything was funny, or?
No, I was diagnosed with depression.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of often what happens with people with bipolar disorder, because we seek help when we're depressed because we feel miserable. But when we're hypomanic, everything's going well and great. So the idea of going to see a doctor for feeling energetic and creative and passionate about stuff is just completely bizarre. So, I never was treated for bipolar disorder or suspected that I had it probably until well into my 30s.
So how did you find out for sure that you had bipolar 1 in your 40s? How did that happen?
I think you told me.
Is that right? No, you told me that you suspected, you told me that you had bipolar.
Well, it was one of the two of us, Steve,
Yeah.
because what happened was, um, I started out having a bit of a hypomanic episode in probably, I think, January of 2010 or 2011, sorry. And it started with a couple of triggering events. Like my wife was diagnosed with kidney disease, and then a friend of mine died of a heart attack.
Mm.
And so I think these were kind of triggering events which sent me climbing up. And then I was not sleeping very well, and so my manic episode was getting more and more severe. I took my kids down to Florida to see my parents, and I did that because my wife just needed a break with her condition. And I found that just that travel from Calgary to Florida was ratcheting me up a bit. My dad actually suspected that I had a manic episode going on because he was familiar with that from my mom. He actually kicked me out of the condo they were staying at because he thought I was too high. So I proceeded to take my kids to Disney World from Naples, and I just kept getting worse and worse. And so by the time I got back to Calgary, I was full-blown manic. Then I had this idea of pulling my entire, actually the first idea I had on the way back from Florida was, because I was in the telecommunications industry, I was really fascinated by Apple, and they just released the iPad. And so I thought, you know what, we should be selling these at TELUS. And so I came up with this idea, and I floated it past my boss, and I said, you know, like, hey, we should do this. And he was not very supportive of the idea. So I dispatched a member of my team to New York to buy 10 of these things and blog about it on the way back to Canada. So I was coming up with all of these you know, crazy ideas, and the main thing I did was I pulled my team together, and Steve was a member of that team. And how many people were on that team back then, Steve? It would have been like
Meeting in Montreal.
the meeting in Montreal.
Yeah, because I know before that you had already told me a couple of years before that you did have bipolar, and that you know, very few people knew it.
Well, I kind of suspected, but it wasn't until that meeting that, you know, you kind of called me out. And what had happened was, I had said to you that I didn't want to talk at all during this meeting.
Yes.
And
You said
then you said to me, James, you talked for 4 hours straight. And I think that's one of the things that happens with bipolar disorder. You just kind of, you go off and you lose track of time, and you're very talkative and pressured speech or whatever. And so that was what was going on with me. And so after that Montreal trip, I flew back to Calgary, and I started to have a bit of a psychotic break. And so I was driving back from the airport, and I was convinced that it was the devil driving me home. And so I mentioned this to my wife the next day, and so she's like, "You got to call the doctor." And you had mentioned to me about this talkativeness at the meeting, so I was pretty suspicious that I might be having a manic episode. And so the doctor told me to go to the emergency room, and so I did, and I told them what was going on. And the next thing I knew, I was locked up, and so that began a 5-week stay in the hospital as they tried to bring me back to level. And so that was when I was officially diagnosed with bipolar 1.
Okay, so when you talked to me before, it was your sort of suspicions, not a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because I remember that very well. It was the first part of the morning, from breakfast to the break, you talked a whole lot. And just before the break, you told the whole group, it wasn't just me, you told the whole group, I've been talking too much, I'm going to be quiet. And then after the break, you talked till lunch. And that's when I said, James, this isn't you. You're not the kind of person who says something and then doesn't do it.
Yeah.
I remember. And then you got
And
yourself.
it was really bad. Like I was, like disruptive in meetings. I went into an executive's office. He was late to the meeting. I blew up on him for being late. Um, it almost cost me my job because he tried to get me dismissed after that. And I was really not in a good place, and the illness was not being managed at all. And so there was like consequences all over the place, family wise, job wise. And it really took that hospital stay to start getting me sorted out.
So were they basically trying to find what kind of medication was going to work?
Um, yeah, I think at first it was also just, when you're admitted to the hospital and on a certificate, there's really kind of three criteria that they're really kind of thinking about. Like, are you a danger to yourself? Are you a danger to others? Or are you at risk of getting worse? And I'm really not sure which one of those criteria they landed on, but I think it was to give me time to calm down, and then also to begin work on figuring out what medication regime would be suitable to manage my illness.
Yeah, because the medication I've learned and you've learned, it's so individual.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and I'll just go back to one thing that you mentioned about getting angry at an executive for being late. And I know that one of the characteristics of a manic episode is the person in the manic episode can sometimes be very prone to anger.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't appreciate this for a while, but when I think back to the episode that I had in my 20s, this was really a characteristic of that part of the manic episode is you get very irritable. So oftentimes when we think about mania, we think about, the energy, the creativity, the exuberance, the grandiosity of it. But it's actually irritability, which is often one of the really bad traits as well, because it frustrates your relationships with other people, and that's been a characteristic of my illness.
And does that irritability come because, oh, these people don't get it?
Sometimes, yeah, I would say impatience is part of it, but I think the other part of it is you can be very goal directed. And so if there's an obstacle to achieving your goal, you just get very frustrated with that.
So you've answered this one partly already. The nature of bipolar varies so much from person to person. So for you, what was it like, and has it changed since you got diagnosed at all?
So let me just talk about a couple of my episodes, just to give you a bit of the characteristic of it, and perhaps why it was so hard to get diagnosed in the first place. I would always have these kind of hypomanic episodes where I had a lot of energy, I was very creative, and I was doing a lot of projects at the same time, and so I thought that was normal.
And you were still in the real world.
Yeah, it was perfect, right? I was doing well. And then I would have these deep depressions where all of the commitments I made when I was manic completely overwhelmed me, and I didn't feel I could accomplish anything. And I was like, had all of this anxiety about getting fired or losing my family or these sorts of things that were really kind of all a consequence of the tear that I was on when I was manic. But I always believed that manic episode was normal, and it was what was paying the bills. And then I had to survive the depression to get back to that manic zone, so I could continue to function and do my work. So it wasn't really until that major episode when I was 40 that I kind of came to grips with the fact that this was just not right. And it was the manic episodes, probably even more than the depressive episodes, that were really holding me back and undermining me. And so after that, and it was just so damaging that, I committed to, treatment. And I acknowledged that the manic episodes were doing more damage than the depressive episodes. And I became quite fearful of going through that again.
Other people with bipolar have told me, they said the depressive episode is when you feel like absolute hell, the worst you can possibly feel. And they said, but it's the manic part that wrecks your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's hard to acknowledge because, I think so much of my identity was tied up in those manic episodes. The grandiosity of it, the creativity, the drive, the energy, that it was very hard to let go of that. And acknowledging that was a problem was probably the first step towards healing and treatment.
So how did you adjust to that, to making that change from your identity being in the manic to your identity where you're successful and have a very good life without being in the manic all the time? How did you maintain the joy and happiness of life and rebuild that while being able to give up the manic?
Well, I don't want to sugarcoat it, Steve, because it was very hard. Okay. And it took quite a few years to sort that out. For a while, I was actually afraid to be happy because I thought that happy was manic.
Okay.
And so if I allowed myself to feel good, then I was well on my way to being back in the hospital again. And so I had to do a lot of counseling in addition to like medication to really wrap my head around, why I had that drive to succeed, why my sense of purpose was tied up in that, and how that was fueling my illness. And so counseling was a really important part of getting to a place where I could be happy and successful and function.
Right. So you had counseling as part of your treatment, and I presume some medication.
Yeah, and it took a long time to get that working too. I was first put on valproic acid, which is one of the standard treatments. That wasn't really working for me because of concern about weight gain. So I switched over to lithium, and that's kind of like the gold standard. But the downside of lithium is kidney damage, and I was starting to experience that. So they moved me over to an antipsychotic medication, Seroquel, and I took that for years.
Yeah.
And it worked great, but it raises your lipids, and so that was a problem. And so it wasn't until maybe 2 years ago that they actually sorted me out on a medication regime, which has been really good. It's kind of helped me stay even. It's allowed me the room to kind of feel good and driven without the manic episodes, and it's controlled for the depression. But it took a long time, Steve, and patience is something that's really important with this illness.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like both aspects, the counseling and the medication, were both necessary.
Yes, and there's probably a few other things that were really
else?
helpful as well. Like, for instance, I belong to a support group.
Yes.
And so being with a group of people who get it, like have walked in your shoes and have battle scars and stories and thoughts and treatments and ideas in terms of how to manage the illness has been hugely beneficial to me. I have a supportive family that gets this illness and is there for me when I'm in trouble. I've generally disclosed the illness to my bosses, and so I've had the support of my company in managing this illness. And I think acknowledging that you can't do it alone has been really opened me up to getting the support that I feel I needed to be effective and successful.
Thank you. And what, other than the treatments, what are some of the changes you made in your life after your diagnosis, and how did those changes help?
Yeah, so there was a few. One, maybe depending on how you look at it, it's either good or bad, and I think it was ultimately good. I started to manage my ambition, for one. I kind of aspired to climb the corporate ladder or run my own company, and I had to come to grips with, maybe that goal wasn't compatible with this illness. And I think that gave me a lot of grief for a while, because like a lot of my identity was tied up in that kind of drive and yearning for that type of success. But the positive out of that was I had a lot more time for my family and hobbies and some sports and stuff like that. And ultimately, I think that's brought me more joy than career ever could. But it was I had to temper my ambition. The second thing has really been like exercise, like trying to manage my energy levels. Probably the most important thing has been sleep. And I can't stress that enough, like getting to bed at the same time every night, getting 8 to 9 hours of sleep every night, trying to get up at the same time every day. Like the sleep hygiene is probably the most important aspect of me managing this illness, because what I learned along the way was, if I wasn't getting enough sleep, I was getting manic. And if I was getting too much sleep, I was getting depressed. And so knowing that, having that insight into my illness has really, really given me probably the biggest tool in managing it.
It sounds like, of course, if a lack of sleep makes you manic, then being manic is going to lead to less sleep. It would be a vicious circle.
Yes, it's quite interesting. Like, I've long believed that, bipolar is as much a sleep disorder as it is a mental health issue. And it's because of this relationship between how much sleep you get and how high or low you become.
That is very interesting. You touched on this, but can you tell a little more about what, in your experience, should the friends and families of people with bipolar be able to do to help them?
Probably, and this is actually really hard, but empathy. And the reason I say it's really hard is because the illness can be so damaging to relationships. And in my case, it was damaging to friendships, it was damaging to family, it was damaging to, workplaces. And all those people that I was pushing away were all the same people that I needed to understand and empathize with my illness, to accept me when I was out of control, and to support me when I was feeling really depressed. And so I think when I was level and I was able to kind of talk about my experiences, it made it easier for these different groups of people to relate to what I was going through. They couldn't experience it, obviously. And maybe it's hard to relate to because it's such an extreme illness, but they could at least acknowledge where I was coming from. And in that, I could have kind of like a language to get going in terms of, like my wife saying, are you feeling a little bit up right now? Or are you feeling a little bit down right now? Would be kind of like code for, are you ill? And so we would be able to talk about the illness in a less charged sort of way.
And it sounds like your family and your wife, they're not judgmental about it. It's a case of, is this happening? If it is, what do we do?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important observation, Steve, is really working with your friends and your family to get to a place where there's no judgment. Judgment is very triggering. Um, like if you're irritable, judgment can set you off. If you're depressed, judgment can set you in a spiral. And so really helping others understand that approach is just not helpful. But coming at it from a more neutral place with empathy is extremely helpful. And so you have to advocate for yourself with friends, families, coworkers, bosses, so that you're getting what you need out of those relationships.
And advocating includes you have to be able to open up to them and be vulnerable enough to reveal some of what's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that leads to, you've talked a lot about this, what can a person who has bipolar do to help themselves? And you've talked about
And
many of these things.
I think probably the most important thing to do is set yourself up with a pit crew. If you think of yourself as a race car,
Yeah.
You have to have people in the pit that can keep you on the road. And the people that are part of my pit crew are my doctor, my psychologist, my support group, my family, and my coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
And so each plays a role in kind of helping to keep me healthy. And I play a role in helping them to understand what I'm going through so that they can support me in managing this illness.
It was really an honor to be part of your pit crew in Montreal on that occasion.
Oh, Steve, if I hadn't had that opportunity to talk to you about it, I don't know if I would have been treated. I might still be off the rails.
Well, from what you said, when you got back to Calgary, you would have been treated. That's as you were, of course.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story. And I think this shows that many people think bipolar is a sort of social or psychological death sentence and their life is ruined. And your experience shows how that does not have to happen. So any last thoughts for people with bipolar and people supporting them about, again, what we started with, living well with bipolar? How do we make this a reality for more people? Because it's certainly worked well for you.
Yeah, like maybe, the parting comment would be, I was very low after that episode when I turned 40, and I did not believe I could rebuild or get back to where I was at. But the people around me believed in me. At work, I was and continue to be given big opportunities to lead strategic important projects for TELUS. So I regained the trust of TELUS to do my work. I was able to regain the trust of my wife and my family, and I was able to rebuild those connections with my friends. And what I learned in that process was, people around you have a tremendous capacity to forgive and understand if you let them. And I think being vulnerable and letting people in on your journey is the first step towards getting to that forgiveness. And if you can get there, you'll find that there's a lot of people out there that are going to help. And you need that to cope with this illness.
So when you were at that low point, the first step in being able to get out of it and build that support was being vulnerable and letting people in.
Yes.
Yeah. Because I know we believed in you at the office. We didn't know what was going on because it's confidential, but we were always thinking and saying, James will be back. Just, it'll take whatever time it takes. He'll be back. We know he'll be with us again.
Thanks.
That was how we felt. And so I think there are many wonderful learnings and lessons in your story. And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to share, and I hope it's helpful to some of your listeners.
I think it will be.